At 04:25 a.m. on June 8, 1944, deep in fog over Normandy's rugged hills, engine roar cut through mist. The 5th Armoured Division pushed forward through dense forest, tanks lined like silent predators awaiting orders. A Sherman M4A2 rumbled forward, its hull trembling under steel and combat weight. Inside, Private First Class Jake Miller gripped turret controls, sweat dripping as chaos consumed the air outside. The enemy was close, too close. Radio crackled to life. They're in range. Zero in and fire. Jake had seen combat before, but this was different. Shelling had been relentless. Germans were closing in. The M4 was a beast, but in battle's heat, reality was clear. Firing from standard turret position wasn't enough. Miller had learned from field time that when standard setup failed, improvisation would save him. "Set it backwards, keep your head low," he muttered. In sheer instinct, he flipped the gun's turret and aimed for the perfect shot, backward. The sight wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. The first shell was all that counted. By June 7th, 1944, at 07:00 a.m., north of St. Lo in Normandy, the sun was barely visible behind thick clouds hanging over war-torn hills. Inside the cramped Sherman hull, Jake Miller's fingers tapped nervously against controls. The tank was old, but had character. The engine hummed, struggling against armor's weight as it snaked along narrow trails. The only sound, aside from engine rumbling, was occasional debris rattling from the sky. Private Miller had been with the 5th Armoured for 2 years now. He'd seen plenty of battles, but Normandy was unlike anything he'd faced before today. The Allied invasion had already shattered German defences along the coast, but the deep countryside was where real struggle lay ahead. The Sherman had a reputation among crews. It was reliable equipment. Not the fastest machine, nor the most powerful, but it could take beatings and keep going forward. Miller had learned early on that it wasn't about brute force in these engagements. It was about precision under fire. The morning had been uneventful so far, but Miller knew it wouldn't last much longer. They were getting close to German lines now. The air crackled with tension of an impending attack coming soon. The men in his tank were familiar faces by now. Sergeant Walters, always shouting orders with a grin on his weathered face. Corporal Anderson, who still had nightmares from the Pacific campaign months ago. And Corporal Miller, his gunner, who had earned a reputation for staying calm under intense fire. But today, there would be a shift in the routine they'd established. The crew had been briefed at dawn. Intelligence reports suggested German forces were dug in around the forest perimeter ahead. Reconnaissance had spotted at least 3 machine gun nests and possibly armoured support further back. The orders were simple: advance, engage, and clear the sector for infantry to move through. Standard operating procedure for armoured units in this campaign. Miller checked his instruments one more time. Ammunition was loaded. Turret traverse was functioning. Communications were clear. Everything by the book. Everything as it should be for another day of grinding forward through occupied France. The Sherman rolled on, tracks churning mud and grass beneath its weight. Morning light filtered weakly through the fog. At 06:48 a.m., rolling up on a German machine gun nest, the first rounds cracked through air like lightning strikes. The Sherman shook violently as it came under fire from hidden German positions in the tree line. The tank's heavy armour absorbed incoming rounds, but the crew could feel vibrations in their bones with each impact. It wasn't just the sound of bullets hitting the hull that mattered. There was a certain energy to it, a constant hum of danger that was now seeping into every part of Miller's body and mind. "Driver, forward, keep moving," Walters shouted from his position. He wasn't panicking, but the urgency in his voice told Miller everything he needed to know about their situation. The enemy had them pinned down in this approach. The turret slowly turned as Miller prepared to return fire at the concealed position, but something wasn't right with the mechanism. The turret felt sluggish under his control, the hydraulics were slow, the motion unsteady and hesitant. Miller cursed under his breath at the malfunction. The tanks had been under heavy use in the last few weeks of campaigning, and the wear and tear was showing through now. The machine wasn't working at peak efficiency anymore, but they couldn't afford to stop and make repairs under fire. In that moment, Miller saw the machine gun nest again. Just a flicker of movement in the foliage, a German soldier, barely visible behind the dense vegetation, adjusting his aim toward their position. Miller didn't hesitate this time. He aimed, fired, and the German soldier was gone in the explosion. But that wasn't the end of their troubles today. More fire came from the left flank, close range this time, the unmistakable sound of artillery closing in on their position. The tank lurched again violently, and Miller's mind clicked into overdrive with tactical calculations. The reality of the moment hit him like a freight train at full speed. The tank's setup, its standard operational state, wasn't enough for this engagement. He needed more precision, more power, something that could shift the momentum in their favor. The hydraulics were failing, the turret was sluggish, and the Germans were pressing hard. Standard doctrine wasn't going to cut it today. By 07:15 a.m., just outside a dense patch of forest, the tank had made it through the first wave of attacks successfully. The Sherman was battered, its paint chipped and the turret twisted slightly off-center from repeated impacts. The crew was rattled but alive and still fighting. They had held the line against the initial German assault. As Miller wiped sweat from his brow, he thought about the next move they needed to make. The standard turret setup was built for sweeping fire, fast and wide, a spray of bullets meant to cover large areas of terrain. But it wasn't built for the kind of precision needed to take out well-hidden, long-range targets effectively, not when every second counted in combat like this. "Sergeant, I think I can do better," Miller said, looking at Walters with quiet determination in his eyes. The sergeant raised an eyebrow, then looked at the tank's damaged turret mechanism with skepticism. "Do what, exactly?" he asked. "Flip it around," Miller replied, a plan already forming in his mind clearly. "Turn the gun backward. It'll give me more precision on target." Walters stared at him for a long moment in the smoke. There were risks, operational risks, mechanical risks, but in that instant they were all irrelevant to survival. "All right, Miller, you've got one shot at this. Don't screw it up," Walters said finally. Miller nodded with understanding. The decision had been made under fire. He swiftly flipped the turret, a task that was normally impossible under combat conditions like these. With the gun facing backward, the target was no longer the standard range they'd trained for. It was closer, tighter, more controlled in its arc of fire. The rest of the crew looked on, unsure of the outcome, but the first test would come soon enough. The battle wasn't over yet. It was just beginning to escalate. Miller felt the weight of the decision, but there was no time for second-guessing now. The Germans would regroup and counterattack within minutes. The forest was alive with movement and danger. This modification would either save them or doom them, and they'd know which within the hour. At 07:47 a.m., as close-range assault began, the Sherman's gun fired with the new configuration. The sound was deafening as the metal projectile shot into the dense brush ahead. The enemy responded immediately with more fire, but Miller had already repositioned, aiming with a steady hand. The shell landed with surgical precision, obliterating a German tank ahead in the tree line. For the first time, Miller felt the difference in the weapon's behavior. The gun fired steadily, without hesitation, its backward setup stabilizing the trajectory in ways he hadn't anticipated. The noise of the battle seemed distant now in his focused state. In his mind, all that existed was the next target, the next shot, the next piece of destruction to accomplish. "Holy hell, it worked!" Walters shouted from the turret hatch, watching the destruction unfold before them. The crew was already adjusting to the new setup, moving quicker, more purposefully than before. The tank's new configuration was starting to pay off in real combat, but then the ground shook again with tremendous force. A massive explosion rocked the left side of the tank from an artillery hit. The enemy was using artillery support now, and the blast had left the tank's left side exposed and vulnerable. Miller could feel the heat through the armor plating. They were in deep trouble, but the gunner had already made his next move instinctively. The backward turret configuration gave Miller a tighter firing arc, allowing him to target with increased accuracy. Where before he'd been sweeping across wide areas hoping for hits, now each shot counted individually. The German positions were well concealed, but the modified setup allowed him to track and engage with methodical precision. Another shell loaded, another target acquired, another impact confirmed. The crew worked in synchronized rhythm, each man understanding his role in this new arrangement. Ammunition handlers moved faster. The loader worked with mechanical efficiency, and Walters coordinated their movements from his command position. The Sherman had become something different than it was an hour ago, more surgical, more deadly, more effective in this particular engagement. By 08:12 a.m., the artillery barrage intensified across the entire sector. The air grew thick with smoke, the dense forest now a blur of movement as German forces advanced on multiple fronts. Miller's hands were no longer steady. His pulse was erratic, and his breath came in short, rapid bursts from exhaustion. The new turret configuration had worked once, but now it was a gamble with each shot. With every shot he was betting his life on precision, under deteriorating conditions. A German tank rounded the corner, barely visible through the smoke and trees ahead. Miller knew he didn't have much time to acquire the target. The mechanics of the tank were starting to fail him with repeated stress, but the moment of clarity from earlier pushed him forward through the fatigue. It had to work again. He aimed, adjusting for the angle of the gun and the target's movement. The shell fired, a perfect shot that hit the German tank's turret dead on target. The explosion sent debris flying in all directions, and the crew inside went silent forever. But as Miller began to reload, a terrifying realization set in about their situation. The tanks weren't the only thing they had to worry about now. The infantry was closing in fast on their position. German soldiers were moving through the forest in squad formations, using the terrain for cover as they advanced. The Sherman was designed to fight other armor, but infantry with Panzerfausts were another threat entirely. Walters called out coordinates as he spotted enemy infantry positions through his periscope. The crew adjusted their tactics, using machine gun fire to suppress the advancing soldiers while maintaining their primary focus on armored threats. The battle had evolved into a complex engagement, requiring multiple responses simultaneously. Miller's modification was proving effective against armor, but they needed support from other units to handle the infantry assault. Radio calls went out requesting backup from nearby American positions. The forest was becoming a killing ground, with neither side willing to give up the terrain they'd fought so hard to control. At 08:45 a.m., with enemy infantry on the approach, the tank's engine hummed through the smoke steadily, its weapons still firing, but the crew was growing tired from continuous combat. The stakes were getting higher with each passing minute. Every shot felt like it could be their last in this engagement. Miller's vision blurred from sweat and cordite smoke. Sweat dripped down his face as he readied another shot at incoming targets. He wasn't thinking anymore about doctrine or procedure. He was reacting purely on instinct and training. The turret was locked, the aim true and steady despite everything. In that moment, everything aligned. A hail of enemy gunfire, the flash of his own cannon. and the world around him went still for a brief instant. The shell impacted a German position, silencing it permanently, but the infantry kept coming through the forest in waves. They were determined, well-trained, and knew the terrain better than the American forces. Miller could see them moving between trees, using cover effectively as they closed the distance. The Sherman's machine guns rattled continuously, brass casings piling up inside the cramped hull. The smell of gunpowder was overwhelming, the heat inside unbearable. Anderson was handling the whole machine gun, sweeping fire across suspected enemy positions. Every few seconds he'd call out bearings and Walters would confirm or redirect. The backward turret setup continued to prove its worth against armoured targets. 2 more German tanks had been destroyed in the last 20 minutes, both with single shots that penetrated critical areas. The precision was unprecedented for Sherman crews in this campaign, but precision meant nothing if they were overrun by infantry before they could reposition. The tank was powerful but vulnerable, especially in close quarters like this forest engagement. They needed to either push forward aggressively or fall back to more defensible positions. Walters made the call to advance, betting that aggressive action would disrupt German infantry formations and give them the initiative back. By 09:02 a.m., in the aftermath of the ambush, the battlefield was silent for a moment unexpectedly. Miller could feel his heartbeat in his ears as the smoke cleared gradually. The tank was still standing, but the crew was exhausted beyond measure. The German forces had regrouped somewhere in the forest depths, and the assault was far from over today. The loss rate among the Allies was growing according to radio reports. This would be a battle of attrition, grinding both sides down relentlessly. Miller wiped his eyes, the sweat mixing with the dirt covering his face, and felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. The tank had survived the ambush, but the true cost had only just begun to reveal itself. 3 American tanks in their platoon had been knocked out during the engagement. Crews were either killed or wounded. Some managed to bail out successfully. The radio crackled with damage reports and casualty counts from across the sector. The 5th Armoured was taking heavy losses in this push through the forest terrain. German defensive positions were stronger than intelligence had suggested, with more armour support than anticipated. The Allied advance was slowing, measured now in meters rather than kilometers. Each tree line captured came at tremendous cost in men and machines. Miller listened to the reports coming through his headset, processing the scale of what they were facing, but his modification was working. Other tank commanders were hearing about it over the radio network. Some were skeptical, others curious about the technical details. Walters reported their success rate to battalion command, noting the increased accuracy and kill ratio since implementing the backward turret configuration. Command was interested, but non-committal, focused on the immediate tactical situation rather than experimental field modifications. The battle continued around them as they held their position, defending the ground they'd taken. German counterattacks came in waves, each one testing their defensive perimeter. The Sherman's ammunition was running low, and resupply would be difficult until the sector was fully secured. At 09:15 a.m., German forces began retreating from the immediate area of engagement. Miller's backward setup had become the weapon of choice for his crew over the last hour. Each shot was clean, each impact devastating to enemy armour and positions. The German forces were retreating now, and the atmosphere on the battlefield shifted noticeably. The Sherman was no longer just another tank in the formation. It had become a sniper, deadly and precise in its engagements. But the pressure was still on the crew significantly. The tank was damaged from multiple hits, and they were running out of ammunition rapidly. Supply lines were stretched thin, and resupply vehicles were having difficulty reaching forward positions through the forest terrain. Other Sherman crews were attempting to replicate Miller's modification with varying degrees of success. Some found the backward turret configuration too difficult to implement under combat conditions. Others lacked the mechanical understanding to make it work effectively, but those who managed it reported similar results: increased accuracy and lethality against German armor. The modification was spreading through informal channels, tank commander to tank commander, as word of Miller's success circulated. Battalion command was now paying attention to these field reports with increased interest. Technical officers were requesting detailed descriptions of the modification for potential documentation and wider implementation across units. The German retreat wasn't a full withdrawal, just a tactical repositioning to stronger defensive lines. They were consolidating their forces, bringing up reinforcements and resupply. The Americans had won this engagement, but hadn't broken through completely. Both sides were exhausted, low on ammunition, and taking stock of their casualties. The forest floor was littered with the debris of battle: destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, shell casings by the thousands. Medical teams were moving forward to treat the wounded from both sides. The temporary lull in fighting gave crews time to perform hasty repairs, reload ammunition, and redistribute personnel from knocked-out tanks to operational vehicles. By 10 a.m., the final push was coming from German positions deeper in the forest. The tank was holding the line, but the crew was dwindling in numbers compared to morning. Their unit had taken casualties, neighboring tanks were knocked out, and they were increasingly isolated. Support infantry had fallen back to consolidate defensive positions behind them. The Sherman and 2 other operational tanks formed the forward defensive line. Walters was coordinating with the other tank commanders via radio, establishing fields of fire and mutual support positions. They'd hold this ground or die trying. Those were the orders from battalion. German armor appeared through the tree line, moving in coordinated formation. This wasn't a probing attack. This was a serious counterattack meant to retake lost ground. Miller identified 3, then 4, then 5 enemy tanks advancing with infantry support. The odds were poor, but the backward turret configuration gave them an advantage in accuracy. With one final adjustment, Miller lined up his shot on the lead German tank. The gun roared with familiar thunder, a perfect shot striking the target's vulnerable side armor. Another victory for the modified setup. But it came at a cost for the crew. The German tanks returned fire, scoring hits on their position. The Sherman rocked violently from the impacts. One of the supporting American tanks was hit and began burning. The crew bailed out successfully, running for cover in the forest. That left 2 operational Shermans against 5 German tanks. The math was terrible, but Miller kept firing with methodical precision. Each shot counted, each hit mattered, each destroyed enemy tank improved their chances. Another German tank was knocked out, then another. The enemy advance faltered as they realized they were taking disproportionate losses. Miller's modification was proving decisive in this engagement, allowing the outnumbered American forces to achieve a favorable exchange ratio. The battle wasn't won, but they were surviving against odds that should have overwhelmed them. At 11:10 a.m., after the storm of combat had passed, the battlefield was quiet finally. Miller stood in the open turret hatch, his hands gripping the cold metal for support. The enemy was gone, withdrawn to defensive positions further back. But the damage was done to both sides. The tank had survived, barely, but the cost had been steep in human terms. Of the platoon that started the morning, only 3 tanks remained operational. Casualties had been high across the company, with many crews killed or seriously wounded. The forest sector was secured, but at a price that would be recorded in after-action reports. Miller looked out over the devastated landscape, seeing the evidence of what they'd accomplished and what it had cost. Walters emerged from the turret, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Battalion wants a full report on your modification," he said quietly. Miller nodded, too exhausted to feel any satisfaction. The backward turret setup had worked, had saved their lives multiple times, had given them an edge when they needed it most. But it couldn't bring back the crews that were lost today. It couldn't erase the memory of watching friendly tanks burn. The war wasn't over, wouldn't be over for a long time. But Miller had done his part, had innovated under pressure, had contributed something useful to the fight. That would have to be enough for now. The afternoon brought resupply vehicles and medical teams to the secured sector. Mechanics examined the damaged Sherman, noting the unusual turret configuration with professional interest. Technical officers interviewed Miller about the modification, taking notes for potential wider implementation. Other tank crews came by to see the setup firsthand, asking questions about implementation and effectiveness. Miller answered mechanically, explaining the technical details without emotion. He was thinking about the men who didn't make it, the tanks that wouldn't return to base. Victory felt hollow when measured against the casualties suffered to achieve it. By 12:00 p.m., walking through the aftermath of battle, Miller's hands were stained with soot and grime. His body was numb from exhaustion and the accumulated stress of continuous combat. The war would continue, would grind forward through France and eventually into Germany itself. But for now he could take a breath and process what had happened. The tank had done its job, had exceeded expectations, had proven the value of field innovation, and he had done his part, had survived, had helped his crew and unit accomplish their mission. That was what mattered in the end. Mission accomplishment and crew survival. Everything else was secondary. Sergeant Walters gathered the crew for a brief meeting behind the tank. They'd been assigned to a reserve position while the Sherman underwent repairs. The backward turret configuration would be documented properly by technical officers for potential training purposes. Other units were requesting information about the modification, wanting to know if it could be replicated. Battalion Command was interested in standardizing the approach if it proved consistently effective across different crews and situations. Miller felt disconnected from these discussions, focused instead on basic needs: food, water, rest, and time to process the day's events. The crew shared what little food they had, eating in silence mostly. Anderson cleaned his machine gun methodically, a ritual that helped him cope with combat stress. Walters reviewed their ammunition expenditure, calculating resupply needs for the next engagement. Miller just sat, watching the sun move across the sky, trying not to think about the morning. The sound of distant artillery reminded them that the war continued elsewhere. Other units were fighting, other crews were dying, other innovations were being tested under fire. The 5th Armoured would be back in action soon enough, pushing forward toward objectives deeper in occupied France. Rest was temporary, a brief respite before the grinding advance resumed. By end of day, June the 7th, 1944, the legacy of that moment would live on in unexpected ways. Miller's backwards setup had become a symbol of ingenuity under pressure, a quiet revolution in the midst of chaos and combat. The official after-action reports noted the increased accuracy and effectiveness of the modified turret configuration. Technical bulletins were drafted describing the field modification for potential implementation across other armoured units. Miller's name was mentioned in these documents, though he'd never see most of them. The information would filter through command channels, reach training units, influence tactical doctrine development. That was how war evolved, through small innovations tested under fire, proven effective, and disseminated throughout the force. But the human cost remained in the foreground of memory. The crews that were lost, the tanks that burned, the wounded who'd never returned to combat. Miller thought about them as evening settled over the forest. The victory they'd achieved was real but incomplete, purchased with blood and sacrifice. The backward turret modification was effective but not miraculous. It couldn't prevent casualties, couldn't guarantee survival, couldn't end the war faster. It was just one small advantage in a conflict that would be decided by industrial production, logistical sustainment, and the accumulated weight of countless engagements like today's battle. Miller understood this instinctively, even if he couldn't articulate it clearly. The night brought relative quiet to the sector. Sentries were posted, defensive positions were improved, and crews rotated through rest periods. Miller lay in his bedroll near the tank, staring up at stars barely visible through lingering smoke. Tomorrow they'd move forward again, engaging new enemy positions, testing their luck and skill against German defenders. The backward turret setup would go with them, a proven tool in their tactical arsenal. Whether it would make a difference in future battles remained to be seen. For now, it had gotten them through today. That was sufficient. The file would record the statistics, the numbers, the tactical outcomes. The memory would carry the weight of everything the numbers couldn't capture.